Hi, my name is Ranger Penn. I work here at the Presidio and I have been here for about 12 years. I work with the Interpretation and Education Department, and one of my favorite subjects is researching the history of the Buffalo Soldiers, who were some of the first African Americans to be garrisoned here at the Presidio at the turn of the century. And I think I gained a lot of interest in this, listening to the stories my dad would tell me about his favorite cowboy shows because his nickname was Cowboy. But I never saw black soldiers coming to the rescue in the Old West. And then I learned that 1 in every 4 soldiers was African American. So it's really intrigued me and kept my interest. The Buffalo Soldiers began in 1867, 1866. By the end of World War II, there were no more units that actually called themselves or were referred to as Buffalo Soldiers. Up until World War II, there was a unit in Italy that had the buffalo on its patch. And they considered themselves spiritual descendants of the Buffalo Soldiers. Well, in the 19th century, they helped with the expansion of the Old West, basically monitoring the activities of Native Americans, doing the stringing of telegraph wires, guarding Pony Express routes, sometimes acting as the only law in the lawless areas of the Old West. Later, they were sent to Hawaii. They were sent to along the Mexican border to settle border disputes. And oftentimes they were used in ceremonial activities, playing in bands and marching in parades for public relations with the Army. There were 4 units of Buffalo Soldiers. There was 2 infantry units and 2 units that were on horseback, 2 cavalry units. Often they were deployed, as I mentioned before, in various far-flung posts in the Old West. But during the 1890s came the Spanish-American War, sometimes known as the Philippine-American War, and they went as far away as Japan and Guam and Hawaii and the Philippines. Upon their return at the turn of the century, many of them were sent to different forts. 1 unit was actually stationed here on the Presidio for 2 or 3 years, and their work evolved into taking care of the national parks. It was the Army that basically took care of Yellowstone and Yosemite and Sequoia. There was no Park Service. The Park Service was not enacted until 1916. Prior to that, it was soldiers who took care of the park, which is why many of our uniforms look rather soldierly in their fashion. It was the soldiers' job to take care of the parks, to make sure that loggers weren't cutting down the trees, hunters weren't killing off all the animals, there weren't any forest fires. And luckily, since the Buffalo Soldiers were stationed here on the Presidio, they also got to be among the first ever park rangers, the people who did the work that park rangers do today. And in that connection, there is a legacy, I think, that has been seldom talked about and seldom revealed on how integral they were to the preservation of national parks. In the wonderful documentary that Ken Burns does, there's a segment on Charles Young and the Buffalo Soldiers. The fascinating thing about Charles Young, he was only the 3rd black graduate of West Point. And when he was assigned to the Buffalo Soldier unit, at one point, he was the only black officer in the United States Army. And he was somewhat of a Renaissance man. Charles Young could speak several languages. He taught at universities. He was one of the first African-American diplomats to be sent overseas. And the Army really had great trouble dealing with Charles Young because they didn't necessarily want to give him an overall command. But his work with the 9th Cavalry in the national parks still stands today. They were the first African-American group to be permanently stationed at the Presidio in 1903, 1904. By 1903, Fort Point was pretty much obsolete. Because of the legacy of the Buffalo Soldiers and the Presidio, there is a photo exhibit on the 2nd floor of the fort. It's a fascinating, I think, historical legacy of their images and what they looked like in their uniforms, dating all the way from the 1870s into 1904. There's a famous popular song written by Bob Marley called Buffalo Soldiers. And in the song itself, if you read the lyrics of the song, it actually does tell you a history lesson. People who became the Buffalo Soldiers fought in the Civil War, and many of them could have also been from the Caribbean, from Jamaica, and from Puerto Rico, because those who were former slaves who joined the army, many of them could have worked on plantations not only on the mainland of the United States, but in the Caribbean islands, because those plantations were owned by the same people, the same companies, the same sugar beet farmers, and the same cotton farmers had land throughout the Caribbean. This transformation of rural farm working African Americans who joined the military, basically because there were so few jobs in an era when people were so segregated. They weren't given the same opportunities as white Americans, so the military became a boon for them because you got $13 a month, you got health care, you got an education, you had a place to stay, you could learn a trade, and you could actually send money home to your family or to your parents, which you could not do working either on a plantation or in a sweatshop in the North. Buffalo Soldiers were actually originally called colored regular. They were members of the U.S. Army. They had fought in the Civil War. There were 180,000 of them at the end of the Civil War, but the nation was not going to keep such a large army. They reduced the army to about 25,000 soldiers, of which about 4,000 or 5,000 were African American. When these African American soldiers went out west and they met the Plains Indians, the Kiowa and the Sioux and the Cheyenne, those Plains Indians referred to them as Buffalo Soldiers because they felt like their curly hair and their black faces reminded them of the buffalo, but it was also the way these soldiers fought and chased those Indians with such a tenacity that the Indians were quite impressed, and they said, you are Buffalo Soldiers.